The hearing will now come to order. Thank the witnesses for your patience, and Mr. Heinrich of New Mexico is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I want to start out with you, Secretary D'Agostino, and sort of preface my comments with what Perry Schlesinger's report said about America's strategic posture when they pointed out the need to really formally designate our nuclear weapons labs as national security laboratories based on their unparalleled R&D capabilities and expertise in science and technology. I believe the vast amount of work for others done at the labs, especially at some of the labs, is really a testament to the recognition by other agencies like the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, that the labs possess state-of-the-art resources and must continue to be robustly funded to meet new and existing challenges. Among the many areas in the FY11 NNSA budget that I'm pleased with is the new account, the Science, Technology, and Engineering Capability, or STEC program, which is funded at $20 million in FY11. I want to ask if you can explain specifically what this funding will allow our labs to accomplish, and how do you envision this program operating in the out years?
Thank you, Mr. Heinrich. Absolutely. We started this line, frankly, following there was a $30 million supplemental in prior years to focus on maintaining a capability, particularly focus on the intelligence area. Because as you know, sir, the scientists and engineers at our laboratories, their expertise that we've fostered over decades in supporting the nuclear deterrent is actually the exact same expertise that is needed to assess what other countries are doing, what other non-state actors might be doing. And we appreciate the supplemental I think it was 2009 supplemental of $30 million. So this request in FY11 is essentially an extension of that as item 1, but actually looking for opportunities to expand the types of what we talked, work for others. I call them strategic partnership agreement with other federal agencies. So I can give you some examples. One is we have an agreement with the Defense Department called the Joint Munitions Agreement, which is focused on high explosives. It's work that's done at Sandia, Los Alamos, and Livermore. And working with the Defense Department together, they set some resources aside, we set some aside to do that. That's one area. Another area is, again, with the intelligence community, to continue on that partnership with the intelligence community. And we met with Director Denny Blair a number of times. Secretary Chu and I have met with Director Blair so that we are working together kind of on that front. And finally, the third area is in the nuclear counterterrorism space with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So there'll be some combination of work in nuclear counterterrorism, intelligence, and possibly work with the Department of Homeland Security in the aviation security arena to address challenges that we face in aviation security and make sure we understand that. The key for us ultimately is to try to align within the federal government what we know other departments are going to need from us strategically in S&T space, see where they cross the Department of Energy's needs, and then use those resources to operate where those two circles overlap. Okay. And there's some great opportunity there, and we're excited about this line as well.
Excellent. I don't need to rehash with you the reasons why NNSA was created by Congress in 1999, but among them was an effort to provide a level of autonomy that would allow for flexibility in operation within the labs. Do you feel that the NNSA is beginning to achieve the level of autonomy that I believe the original NNSA Act intended?
It's hard to actually, to go back to the original intentions. I would look at it as there's been an evolution, at least from what I've seen from my perch within the department. We've been able to achieve significant autonomy in the area of human capital management, and it's allowed my director of management, Mike Kane, who's now working for the secretary directly on this area, because he did such a great job in the NNSA. The secretary says, "Oh, I need that capability to help me in the rest of the department." so he's moved over to help there. But human capital management in the procurement area has allowed us to be much quicker in responding to procurements because we're a bit of a smaller organization, and it's allowed us to move forward there. As administrator, I have certain authorities that the NNSA Act provided me with respect to accepting or not accepting what I would say consensus-based directives that have no applicability necessarily to the kind of work we do. And I haven't used that a lot, but most recently we've been able to look at trying to drive reform and taking a look at those orders. Chairman Winokur described some of this earlier, and we're clearly going to be working closely with the board on these things. But I believe it's allowed us to move forward fairly aggressively under the rubric of the administrator. I'm satisfied. I'm quite satisfied with the way that we're working within the department and the flexibility I have.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The ranking member is now recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. NNSA's budget request contains an almost 40% reduction in funding for weapons dismantlement and disposition from the FY 2010 level. In light of the significant backlog of retired systems in storage, could you explain why NNSA is reducing funding for dismantlement activities by such a significant percentage in just one fiscal year?
Absolutely. There are a couple of reasons, and I'll line them up, but it's a combination of events. One is we did have a plus-up increase in FY10 of about $12 million. So that doesn't explain the whole amount, but there was a specific increase. The second increase, why we had more money in FY10 that we're planning on, we think we need for FY11, is the safety authorization basis work that we needed to do, our most complex weapon system dismantlement work on the W-84 or the B-53, for example, particularly the 53, it's taking a long time, and so we feel that by the time FY10 is done, we'll have finished the authorization basis work, the tooling, the methods and approaches needed to take apart that warhead. And so by FY11, by the time FY11 starts, we'll be in the business of actually taking apart that warhead in and of itself. And the third piece of the difference is we had a fairly big ramp up in FY09 and FY10 to make a concerted effort to dismantle what we call canned subassemblies, or CSAs, or secondaries of warheads. This happens in Y12, and Y12 undertook a very big push to really work off their backlog of CSAs. In FY11, it goes back to what our normal rate was that we submitted in our classified report. So it's those combinations of those three particular things. So right now what we have essentially are the tools and the authorization basis process we feel we're going to get done by the time FY11 starts. Now it's a matter of cranking out the dismantlement activities themselves. One thing I might add, if I could, and that is each warhead, each type of warhead is different from a dismantlement standpoint. Some warheads may only take 2 or 3 shift works of work at Pantex to take apart, where another warhead takes actually a full month to do. I mean, there's a lot of questions that say, well, that means you're not taking apart as many warheads, and it's very difficult to say, you know, a W-79 is the same thing as a B-53, is the same thing as a W-76. They all have different rates of dismantlement. But the key is not to take them apart fast, but it's to take them apart safely. And that's job one.
Turning to the issue of security, I'm always concerned, as I stated in my opening statement, that we don't have a margin of error. And I think everyone is very dedicated to this issue. But perhaps you guys could speak on, and Mr. D'Agostino, what steps are NNSA and DOE taking to improve and make more consistent the management of protective forces throughout the nuclear security complex?
Certainly. From a security standpoint, we've taken a number of steps. The first thing that we've done, well, not the first thing we've done, one of the things we've done is implemented a process called a zero-based security review. And that's to make sure that the work that we do, the way we do approach security at one site is consistent from an operational and vulnerability assessment standpoint to the security work that's done at another site. Previously, we let each site do their vulnerability assessments, and each site had a different approach. And so what you ended up with, even though each site had the same design basis threat, their approach to security was a little bit different. It was all fine, but it was a different approach, and so we had some inefficiencies there. So the zero-based security review is actually going to walk us through consistency from a vulnerability assessment standpoint. The other things we're doing is we're driving commonality in equipment purchases, specifically armor and armored vehicles and the like, the weapons that the security forces use, driving commonality there, commonality in training. We learned this, I'd say the hard way in some respects, where we had a strike at one of our sites, and we brought in security forces from other sites, and we spent a significant amount of time training the security forces from the other sites on the different protocols at this one particular site. So now what we're doing is we're pushing for commonality in uniforms, training, equipment purchases, weapons, and that drives efficiency into the enterprise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member. Mr. Larson is now recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Normally I would make some comments with regards to environmental management, but talking with folks from the state and the delegation with regards to Hanford, generally things seem to be moving along fairly quickly. I would just make a note that I would say fairly well. It's never quickly at Hanford, fairly well. But I generally will just make a note that the work being done at places like Hanford, the cleanup is a legacy that we do need to move forward on. I think last year I called it the America's ultimate toxic asset in the throes of debate here in the committee when they were looking at cutting the EM budget. We managed to restore that, and that's all great, and I hope we've learned a lesson about the need for a robust EM budget, not just for Hanford, but obviously other sites around the country. Chairman Winokur, I talked to you a little bit ahead of time about this question. I wanted to have you a little prepared. I visited Y-12 last year with NNSA folks, and I wanted to chat with you about as they shrink the footprint. What kinds of steps are being done to continue or try to maintain the safety of the workplace, especially in 9212, given the age of it? So, how is that working out, and what do you foresee in terms of costs being part of that process? What are your folks looking at with regards to that?
Well, as I mentioned before, we characterize the 9212 facility as an unsound facility. And we're in a situation right now where we have this unsound facility, and eventually we're going to build the uranium processing facility. So there is this gap, this transitionary period. And the board is working very closely with NNSA and the site Y-12 to make sure that we understand the risks that we're taking, which eventually is DOE's decision to continue operations there. It's not the board's, but we do want to carefully understand the risks associated with operating that facility, which is extremely important. And right now at that facility, improvements are being made to reduce the risk. The most important way to do it is to reduce the material at risk, and they've done a pretty good job of that. They've reduced the amount of uranium in safe bottles, and they have other initiatives to improve the electrical systems, ventilation systems, fire suppression at the site. So we do have an active program in place, and I think eventually there's a line item that is coming in to make those additional improvements at that site. So we're in this situation where the board is really reviewing the safety of that facility on a yearly basis to ensure itself that that plant should continue to operate. And I can't guarantee you that it will make the complete transitionary period between its existence today and when UPF comes online, except to say that the board strongly supports the uranium processing facility because it really will represent a major improvement in facility at the site.
Thanks. I want to give Secretary D'Agostino an opportunity to respond to that, if you could. As well, I want to ask you to sort of shift a little bit here to the Navy nuclear enterprise and you discussed the Ohio-class replacement reactor in your testimony. Obviously, in the Navy budget in about 2019, we're going to see, if in fact things go on time, the Ohio-class replacement come on, and we're going to have to start spending real money for the replacement. And that's going to potentially, all things being equal, squeeze out other shipbuilding requirements unless we figure out that problem. Do you have a similar, are we going to see a similar balloon in the Navy nuclear enterprise budget as far as the development of the reactor for the replacement? If you answer that first, and then maybe you could return then to the question about Y-12.
Certainly. The plan we have right now for the next 5 years is, as you may be aware, is to do the core design development, start testing some of these fuel elements in the prototype refurbishment that'll get done that's happening around the 2017 timeframe. So what we're going to see is a ramp up in the work that happens in the Naval Reactors budget. The next 5 years is pretty well understood. We understand where that's going. The year 2016 as well. We have a pretty good understanding where that's going. It will likely involve continuing increases in resources. Whether there is a discontinuity, it would be hard for me to say. I'd like to take that one for the record and get back to you on that. So that way, so you'll have the actual data that we expect in the out years. Yeah. But clearly, the money that we have right now over the next 5 years is what we feel is necessary to do the development of the core and to be able to start testing of those components. We're already doing the material testing and some of the radiation testing as well. Okay. On the Y-12 part of your question, sir, I agree with the chairman. We have a facility that requires a lot of attention. We've compiled a very long list of things that, given unlimited resources, we would fix, but we don't have unlimited resources, so we've prioritized that work to the things that have to happen most expeditiously to allow us to operate that facility for the next 10 years or so, while we continue to work with the board, certainly early on, to get that design just right for the UPF and transition out. So clearly, I mean, there's always this tension of a dollar I spend on the 9212 is a dollar less that I can spend on the uranium processing facility. But the most important thing is to do what we need to do to ensure that things that have the highest risk are taken care of in 9212, because the nation's going to rely on that facility for the next 10 years. And so it's fairly critical work. I believe every year we're going to be, we'll be back and forth with the board and re-examining those risks, because it's a dynamic situation. Something may come up, heavy rain, what have you. We make adjustments to that balancing list. So we have this MRR project, Material Risk Reduction Project, to do that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Before we go to Mr. Heinrich for one last question, who I knew he had one additional question that he wanted to ask. I thought, Chairman Winokur, I understand that some of the members of the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board are here with us. I thought this might be a nice opportunity if you would introduce them and maybe say a word or two, if that's possible, about each.
Thank you. Let me first introduce Dr. John Mansfield, our resident genius on the board.
Very good. Always good to have a resident genius.
And I'd like to introduce Mr. Joseph Bader, who has a tremendous amount of experience in industry and quite expert in project management.
Excellent. Thank you for being here.
And we have Mr. Larry Brown, who is a former naval officer, a captain. He's used to running ships, and he's trying to apply the same to the board.
Excellent.
And we actually have a new member who was confirmed last week, and that is Ms. Jessie Robertson. And she will probably report for duty in a couple of weeks. And her previous experience was she was actually a member of the board for approximately 1 year, and she served in the same position as Secretary Trier. And she has industrial experience.
Outstanding. Well, thank you for that. Gentlemen, thank you for the work that you're doing, and we appreciate your outstanding work for the country. Thank you. With that, we'll turn to Mr. Heinrich for a last question.
Do you mind if it's two?
Don't push it. Don't push it, Heinrich.
All right. I'll pick one. Secretary D'Agostino, I'm very pleased at the direction in funding this year at Sandia in terms of RTBF, the Readiness and Technical Base Facilities, the direction that it's heading in FY11, although it is significantly lower than the levels we saw just a couple of years ago in FY09. And I'm in particular concerned about the ramifications of that over time with regard to MESA, the Major Environmental Test Facilities, and the need to not fall behind in terms of the recapitalization of that facility to make sure that as the fabrication facility stays up to date with industry standards and is able to fully support the next generation of microelectronics for our stockpile systems. Do you share some of those concerns?
I do share, I would say generally I share concerns on this balance between, making sure we don't fall behind on our recapitalization efforts and maintaining the facilities, particularly as we bring new facilities online. General Herrensack, who is here with me, actually runs defense programs. He and I have talked about deferred maintenance quite a bit. We've talked about the fact that we do have had great success, frankly, in our program in recapitalization resources and in the science resources and in the DSW resources. That's sometimes we have to make sure, not sometimes, we always have to make sure that we don't forget just taking care of business on a day-to-day basis with our current facilities. So he actively looks at that. He's going to be getting back to me in a not too distant future. We're going to talk about what do we need to do to make sure that when we look, particularly since we're in the throes of developing our FY12 program and budget right now, on how do we make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation 10 years from now where we said, well, if I had just taken care of this facility, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. So that is a constant concern of mine. Chairman?
Do I get the full 5 minutes, or you're going to cut me off there? All right, thank you. Last question, Secretary Trier. You've heard this one before, but I wanted to ask what you're doing to meet DOE's responsibility, not just to clean up these legacy sites, but to assess and restore the natural resources which have been damaged at DOE sites around the country. And to just provide some context for folks, that is a statutory responsibility, and one which I think is more easily met when you do the two together as opposed to in series.
Thank you very much for that question. I recently met with Secretary Ron Curry just on this particular question, and we thank you for your leadership throughout this process. I'm happy to report that we have made a decision on doing the assessment and for damages, and that we are going to be in the process of issuing the request for proposal. The system is going to be issuing the request for proposal, and we will provide the resources for that assessment. In addition to that, as a matter of policy, you and I have discussed in these venues plus one-on-one the wisdom of not waiting until after all of the cleanup is completed to start restoring and addressing the damages. So we are committed to doing that simultaneously, the cleanup as well as the damages, because at the end of the day, we think that that is more cost-effective, plus much more responsible to the concerns that have been expressed at places like Los Alamos. We are committed to working with you as well as Secretary Curry on pressing forward. And we believe that the state has actually shown a tremendous amount of leadership. We want to ensure that we take full advantage of that leadership shown by New Mexico.
Well, I want to thank you for your progress on that front. I really do. Go ahead, Chairman.
Very good. Thank the gentleman. And I'm going to take the prerogative as chair to ask one last question. But before I do, Mr. Larson had asked for some time for a few minutes, so yield to Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to give you a few minutes just for Secretary D'Agostino. I want to let you know I'll just be following up with you and your office with regards to the framework for a memorandum of agreement for interactions between NSA and the broader national security community, and some of the suggestions that I've been hearing from some folks. So I'll follow up with you and your staff on that. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. And lastly, for Mr. D'Agostino, last year, the Jason Scientific Panel's review of the NNSA's life extension program found that the stockpile surveillance program is becoming inadequate. They concluded that, and I quote, continued success of stockpile stewardship requires implementation of a revised surveillance program, end quote. So my question is, has the NNSA revised the surveillance program in ways that will assure the continued success of the stockpile stewardship program? And if so, could you describe them to the committee?
The answer is yes, we've revised it. And the FY11 request will allow us to fully implement those plans. And let me describe the plans if I could. We've made a concerted shift not to just put more money in what we call the enhanced surveillance line, which is developing tools for future types of surveillance that we can do, but with actually taking apart warheads and looking at and collecting a lot of data out of those particular warheads. So that's the additional resources, about $55 million more than we've had previously in the FY11 request, will allow us to take apart that full suite of warheads that we were originally planning on doing. Another element of the revision of the surveillance program is to fully exploit the data that we do have. In many respects, in the past, what was done, it was just kind of a rote, take apart X number of units per year, gather this information, and focus it that way. What we want to do is actually factor in now, start focusing where we're looking based on the information we get out of what our codes tell us, what our predictions tell us we should be looking for. So that way it's a bit more of a focused surveillance than just kind of a broad surveillance across the board. Final element of surveillance is trying to take advantage of dismantling nuclear warheads. Obviously, we've got an active program of dismantling nuclear warheads, and there are opportunities to fully exploit all that information that comes out of that, in addition to what we would regularly call a normal surveillance activity, where we take a warhead apart and then put it back together again. So it's that this FY11, FY12, FY13 program that we have here in front of us will address, in my opinion, and in the opinion of our experts in defense programs, the core of what the Jasons were talking about. But the key, again, will be sustaining this over time, sustaining that level of focus. Let's not let the resources drift away from the surveillance area like we had done in the past, as we tried to balance things as they got smaller and smaller. So sustaining it over time will be important.
I agree, and I hope that you'll allow us to work with you and make sure that you have the tools and the resources that you need to continue your work and also the work, particularly in the surveillance program.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it would be an honor to do that.
Very good. And on a last note, I want to thank you publicly for accompanying me on my first trip to our labs at Sandia and Los Alamos. It was an eye-opening trip, time well spent, and I deeply appreciate the work that you're doing there and all the work at the folks at the labs. It's outstanding work and an important national asset. And thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If there's nothing else, with that, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. As always, it's been very helpful and enlightening. And the members may have additional questions that they'll submit for the record, and I would ask that you respond to those expeditiously in writing. With that, thank you again, and the committee stands adjourned.